The dust in the air was a physical presence, a fine ochre-colored shroud that coated everything in the small, forgotten town of Redemption. In West Texas, 1857, towns like this were little more than a collection of weary-looking wooden shacks clinging to a dry riverbed. Sheriff Jedediah Cole squinted against the late afternoon sun, the golden light turning the dust motes into dancing embers. The heat was a constant oppressive force, a tangible weight on his shoulders as he walked the main street, the squeak of his worn leather boots a familiar, lonely rhythm. Jedediah, a man in his late 40s with a face weathered by sun and sorrow, had seen his share of hardship. But the past few weeks had a different kind of burden. It started with whispers, soft as the wind through the tall prairie grass, carried from one porch to the next. Whispers about the Caraway family. The Caraways lived a few miles out of town, a quiet, God-fearing family of 5. Elias, his wife Martha, and their 3 children. The eldest, 13-year-old Silas, and the younger twin girls, Eleanor and Beatrice, aged 10. The whispers spoke of Silas, a boy known for his quiet demeanor and steady hands. They said he was changed. Not sick, not hurt, but different. People claimed he spoke in a low, raspy voice that wasn't his own, that his eyes held a cold emptiness that chilled you to the bone. Mrs. Gable, who ran the general store, swore she saw him staring at her with an intensity that made her drop a sack of flour. Old Mr. Henderson, a man who saw no good in anyone, muttered about the devil's work. Jedediah, a man of simple faith and practical sense, dismissed it as gossip born of fear and boredom. These isolated communities had a way of turning small oddities into grand narratives. He told himself it was just a boy going through a difficult phase, maybe a fever, or the stress of growing up on the harsh frontier. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Then came the first sign that something was truly wrong. Elias Caraway rode into town, his face ashen, his hands trembling. He found Jedediah in his office, the air thick with the smell of old paper and gun oil. "Jedediah." Elias's voice was a hoarse whisper. "It's Silas. He's not right. He won't eat. He won't speak. He just sits and stares, and sometimes he says things." "What things, Elias?" Jedediah asked, his tone calm, though a prickle of unease started to crawl up his spine. Elias looked away, his gaze fixed on a point far in the distance, as if seeing something terrible only he could perceive. "He speaks of things he couldn't possibly know. The fire that took the miller's barn last winter. The secret debt Mr. Henderson has with a man in San Antonio. He talks about people's sins, Jedediah. He whispers about them in a voice that sounds like a dry riverbed groaning." Jedediah felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The miller's barn fire had been ruled an accident, but there had always been rumors of foul play. And Henderson's debt was a closely guarded secret. How could a 13-year-old boy know such things? Jedediah tried to find a rational explanation. Maybe Elias was exaggerating, fueled by fear. Maybe the boy had overheard conversations. But Elias's desperation was palpable. He wasn't a man given to flights of fancy. He was a homesteader, a man of the land, as solid and dependable as the oak tree in his yard. He looked at Jedediah with a raw, pleading look. He says he knows how it will all end. He says he knows what will happen on Easter Sunday. That the devil has a message for this town, and that he's the one to deliver it. The word devil hung in the air, heavy and blasphemous, in a place where faith was the only bulwark against the vast, unforgiving landscape. Such talk was both terrifying and powerful. It was the kind of talk that could unravel a community. Jedediah rose from his desk, his posture firm. He put a hand on Elias's shoulder, feeling the bone and muscle beneath the worn denim. "Elias, I'll ride out with you. We'll talk to the boy. There's a reasonable explanation for all of this, I'm sure." But as they rode out of town, the setting sun casting long skeletal shadows across the land, Jedediah couldn't shake the unsettling feeling. He looked at the vast, desolate landscape, the endless sky, and felt a profound sense of isolation. Here, in this empty expanse, there was no one to turn to, no one to help. Just him, a desperate father, and a boy who was speaking with a knowledge that no one should possess. The Holy Week was approaching, and with it, a creeping dread that promised to swallow more than just the light of day. The weight of the whispers was now a tangible pressure, and Jedediah knew deep in his gut that the silence to come would be far, far worse. Remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more dark, real-life horror stories. The Caraway homestead was a small, well-kept beacon of order in the chaos of the West Texas scrubland. Elias's wife, Martha, met them at the door, her face a mask of weary sorrow. Her eyes, normally filled with a gentle light, were now hollowed with fear. Jedediah removed his hat, the gesture a small acknowledgement of the heavy atmosphere. The air inside the cabin was stale and heavy, filled with the scent of old wood, unwashed clothes, and a faint, acrid odor that Jedediah couldn't place. They found Silas in his room, sitting on the edge of his bed. The room was small, with a single window looking out onto the parched landscape. The boy was motionless, his body a rigid, unnatural pose. His hands were clasped in his lap, the knuckles white. His face was thin, his skin a sallow, unhealthy color. But it was his eyes that truly held Jedediah's attention. They were wide and unblinking, a deep, unsettling brown that seemed to hold no warmth, no light, no recognition. He didn't look at them as they entered, his gaze fixed on the opposite wall. "Silas," Elias said, his voice soft, pained. "Jedediah's here to see you." The boy didn't move. He didn't even blink. He seemed more like a statue than a person. Jedediah approached him slowly, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, a subconscious comfort in this disquieting scene. He knelt down, trying to meet the boy's gaze. "Silas, son," Jedediah said, his voice low and steady. "Elias is worried about you." "What's going on?" For a long, agonizing moment, there was only silence. Then a slow, rattling breath escaped the boy's lips. His head turned, a deliberate mechanical motion, until his unblinking eyes were fixed on Jedediah. A shiver ran down the sheriff's spine. Those eyes, they were not Silas's eyes. They were cold, empty portals to a place of profound absence. "He knows," the boy said, his voice a low, dry rasp. It was the same voice Elias had described, a sound that seemed to scrape against the very air. "He knows what the sins of the father have wrought." Jedediah's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about, son?" The boy's lips twisted into a thin, humorless smile. It was not a smile of joy or amusement, but one of malevolent knowing. "The sins of the Caraway family run deeper than the well water. The crows know. They watch and wait. The reckoning is coming." Elias gasped, a quiet, pained sound. "Silas, stop it! What are you saying?" Silas's eyes shifted to his father. The malevolent smirk widened. "You took the land, Elias. You took the crows' land. You thought they were just stories, just spirits in the wind, but they're not. They're here, and they're hungry." Jedediah's mind raced. He knew the stories, the local tribes, the ones that had been pushed off this land decades ago, had a legend about the crows, not the birds, but something else. A kind of primal, vengeful spirit tied to the earth. It was a myth, a campfire tale to scare children. But Silas's words, the raw conviction in his voice, made the old fears feel new again. Jedediah tried to reason with the boy. "Silas, that's just a story. The crows aren't real. You're just sick. Your mind is playing tricks on you." The boy's head tilted, a gesture of pure contempt. "Your mind plays the trick, Sheriff. It tells you there is no darkness in the world. It tells you that every man is good at heart, but you know better. You know the secrets of this town. The stolen cattle, the cheated wife, the quiet man who beats his children. You know. And they know you know. The boy's gaze found Jedediah's again, and the sheriff felt a sudden, sharp jolt of fear. Silas began to speak, his voice a chilling monotone, reciting a list of every crime Jedediah had ever had to deal with in redemption. He spoke of the Miller fire, but with a detail only the perpetrator could have known. How they used a kerosene lantern left in the barn to make it look like an accident. He spoke of Mr. Henderson's debt, but revealed the reason for it. A gambling addiction he had kept secret for decades. He spoke of a family dispute over a land claim, a dispute that had been long forgotten by everyone but the parties involved. The details were too specific, too accurate to be mere guesses. The boy was a vessel for something, a conduit for a chilling, intimate knowledge of the town's darkest secrets. Elias, now sobbing, fell to his knees. Martha clutched her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. The twin girls, Eleanor and Beatrice, were huddled in the doorway, their small faces pale with fear. Jedediah stood up, a cold sweat slicking his brow. This wasn't just a sick boy. This was something else entirely. The rational part of his mind, the part that dealt in facts and evidence, was screaming for an explanation. A hidden observer. A clever trick. But the other part, the part that was steeped in the fear and folklore of this isolated place, saw something far more terrifying. Elias looked up at him, his face streaked with tears. Jedediah, you have to help us. There has to be a way, something, anything. This is a sickness of the soul. Jedediah looked at the unblinking cold eyes of the boy and felt a profound sense of helplessness. The sun was setting, casting long, menacing shadows through the window. Holy Week had begun, and with it, the unsettling feeling that redemption was about to face a judgment it wasn't prepared for. Jedediah returned to town with a heavy heart and a mind churning with questions. He couldn't shake the image of Silas, the boy's eyes holding a profound emptiness, his voice a chilling vessel for the town's buried secrets. The rational explanations he clung to felt like a crumbling dam against a rising flood. Something was wrong, deeply and fundamentally wrong, and it was tied to the Caraway family. He knew who he had to see. Reverend Abernathy. The Reverend was a stern, unyielding man of God, but he was also the town's moral compass. Jedediah found him in the small Spartan church, dusting the pews in preparation for the Holy Week services. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and beeswax. Abernathy listened to Jedediah's account of his visit to the Caraway homestead, his face impassive, his hands resting on the back of a pew. When Jedediah finished, there was a long, heavy silence. You say the boy speaks of things he couldn't know. Abernathy's voice was a low rumble, devoid of judgment. He speaks of the sins of this town. That's right, Reverend. He told Elias he took the Crow's land. He spoke of Mr. Henderson's debt and the Miller's barn fire in detail. He said the reckoning is coming. It's not right. It's not human. Abernathy looked at Jedediah, his gaze piercing. Jedediah, you are a man of law, and your faith is practical, not mystical. But what you describe, it has a precedent. In the old texts, there are accounts of a certain kind of torment. A knowledge not of God, but of something else entirely. Something ancient and malevolent. Jedediah felt a cold dread settle over him. You think, what Elias thinks? That it's the devil? Abernathy sighed, a slow, weary exhalation. I don't know. The boy is not speaking gibberish, and that is what worries me. He is speaking truths, albeit terrible ones. But the source of that knowledge is what we must be wary of. It could be a trick of the mind, a delusion, or it could be something far darker. He moved to the front of the church, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He picked up a worn Bible from the lectern, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. There are things in this world that we don't understand, Jedediah. Things that prey on fear and weakness. This town, it has its sins, small ones perhaps in the eyes of the world. But here they are big enough to cast long shadows. The Caraway family. They are not without their own secrets. Jedediah's eyes narrowed. What secrets, Reverend? Abernathy looked at him, his gaze direct. Elias Caraway. Before he came to redemption, he was a homesteader in Kansas. He was known for his ruthless land dealings. There were whispers of a family he drove off their land, a family that lost everything. Elias's success here was built on a ruin. He made a pact with a wealthy rancher, Mr. Sterling, to secure his homestead. A pact that wasn't entirely honest. Jedediah's mind went back to Silas's words. The sins of the father have wrought, and you took the crow's land. Was the boy's knowledge a manifestation of his father's guilt, a psychological burden that had finally broken through? Abernathy's voice was a low murmur. Perhaps Silas overheard something. Perhaps he has a vivid imagination. But his words are striking at the heart of our community's fears. He is a reflection of our collective guilt. The question is, how do we deal with it? Jedediah felt a growing sense of frustration. The Reverend was speaking in riddles, and the problem was a boy who needed help. Reverend, he's not just speaking of things, he's in a catatonic state. He won't eat, he's not himself. We need a doctor, not a sermon. Abernathy shook his head slowly. Jedediah, there's no doctor closer than San Antonio. And by the time we get one here, it may be too late. The family is in torment. We have to do something. The people of this town, they are already talking about a curse, about a devil. We need to act, and we need to act with faith. The Reverend's plan was audacious. He proposed a communal prayer, a gathering of the townspeople, a show of faith and solidarity to combat the growing fear. But Jedediah saw the danger in it. The people were already terrified. Bringing them together to focus on the possessed boy could backfire, turning a difficult situation into a powder keg. But Abernathy's resolve was firm. We must face this, Jedediah. We must not let fear divide us. This is a test of our faith. We will go to the Caraway home. We will pray for the boy. We will drive out this sickness of the soul. Jedediah looked at the Reverend, at the stern, unyielding belief in his eyes. He knew he was playing with fire. The whispers had already begun to turn into a low, simmering paranoia. But what else could he do? There was no doctor, no outside help. The isolation of redemption was both its sanctuary and its prison. As Jedediah left the church, the sun was setting, painting the sky in a bruised palette of purple and orange. The town was quiet, but he could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken fear, the quiet suspicion. They were all waiting for Holy Week, for the reckoning that a 13-year-old boy had promised. And Jedediah knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the coming days would be anything but holy. Holy Thursday dawned with an unsettling stillness. The air, usually thick with the sounds of daily life, was hushed. The town of Redemption was holding its breath. The news of Silas Caraway's condition and the Reverend's plan had spread like wildfire. By mid-morning, a small but significant number of the townspeople had gathered. They were a motley crew. Weary homesteaders, pious women in their Sunday best, and curious men whose faces held a mix of fear and morbid fascination. Jedediah stood on the outskirts of the crowd, his arms crossed, his face a mask of weary vigilance. He watched as they assembled, their faces a roadmap of their individual sins and secrets. He saw Mr. Henderson, whose gaunt face was pale with a terror Jedediah knew wasn't just for the boy. He saw Mrs. Gable, clutching a well-worn rosary, her lips moving in a silent prayer. He saw the quiet man who had been accused of striking his children, his eyes darting nervously. Reverend Abernathy, Bible in hand, stood at the head of the group, his posture rigid and determined. He led them on the long ride to the Caraway homestead. The journey was silent, punctuated only by the creak of wagon wheels and the occasional cough. The silence was more unnerving than any sound. It was the silence of people walking toward a reckoning. When they arrived, the Caraway home was a scene of quiet desperation. Elias and Martha stood on the porch, their faces etched with a profound exhaustion. The twin girls, Eleanor and Beatrice, were huddled behind them, their eyes wide and frightened. The crowd dismounted, their movements slow and cautious, like a herd of cattle sensing a storm. Reverend Abernathy approached the family, his voice a calm, reassuring balm. "Elias, we are here to pray for Silas. We are here to stand with you against this darkness." Elias nodded, his eyes filled with a weary gratitude. "Thank you, Reverend. Thank you all." They moved into the small cabin. The air was still thick and heavy. Silas was still on his bed, his position unchanged. The congregation stood in the small living room, overflowing into the other rooms, their collective presence filling the space with a nervous energy. The Reverend asked them to form a circle, and they did, surrounding the boy's room. "We will pray." Abernathy's voice was a low, steady command. "We will pray for the soul of this child. We will pray for the strength of his family. We will not let this darkness take hold." The prayers began, a soft, low murmur of voices. The Lord's Prayer, the Hail Mary, simple appeals for divine intervention. But as the prayers went on, something began to change. The silence that had filled the cabin began to fill with a different kind of sound. A low, guttural moan from the boy's room. The prayers faltered, a few people stopping to listen. The moan grew louder, more pained, like the sound of an animal in a trap. Then, Silas's voice, the dry, rasping sound that Jedediah had heard before, cut through the prayers. "Hypocrites," the voice hissed. The word hung in the air, a venomous whisper that silenced the congregation. "You pray to a God you don't believe in. You pray for a child whose innocence you've already stolen." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Reverend Abernathy, his face pale but his resolve firm, raised his voice. "Silence, foul spirit. You have no power here." "Don't I?" Silas's voice was now a chilling, theatrical whisper. "I have the power of truth. You, Mr. Abernathy, you preach temperance and charity, but you took the last of your brother's inheritance for this church, leaving him to die a pauper." Abernathy's face went white. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. The people in the room shifted, their eyes darting between the boy's room and the speechless Reverend. Then the voice turned to a woman in the crowd. "Mrs. Gable, you pray for a family you envy. You pray to a God to punish them for the success you could not achieve. You stole from your own sister, and you smile while you pray." Mrs. Gable's face crumbled, her hands covering her mouth in a silent sob. The voice moved from person to person, revealing their hidden sins with a ruthless, chilling accuracy. The quiet man who beat his children, the man who had cheated on his wife, the woman who had stolen from her employer. The secrets were mundane, but in the close, claustrophobic atmosphere of the cabin, they felt monumental. The collective guilt was a thick, palpable presence. The prayers had stopped entirely. The people stood in a shocked silence, their faces filled with a mixture of terror and shame. The boy's words were like an acid, eating away at the foundation of their community. Jedediah watched, a cold knot forming in his gut. This wasn't a show. This wasn't a trick. The knowledge was too specific, too personal. It was as if someone had peered into their very souls and read their deepest, darkest secrets. Elias and Martha looked on in horrified silence. Eleanor and Beatrice were now openly weeping, clutching their mother's skirt. The congregation was no longer a group of believers. They were a collection of terrified individuals, their sins laid bare for all to see. Reverend Abernathy, finally finding his voice, shouted, "This is the devil's work. The devil preaches with the venom of truth. We must fight this. We must pray louder. We must stand together." But the congregation was already beginning to scatter. A few men, their faces a picture of shame, turned and walked out. A woman began to sob uncontrollably. The sense of unity, of faith, had been shattered by the boy's chilling words. The congregation had become a scattering of frightened souls, each carrying the weight of their own exposed secrets. The exorcism was a failure. The darkness had not been cast out, it had been invited in. The sun, now low on the horizon, cast long, menacing shadows through the cabin's window. The Holy Week was no longer a time of salvation. It had become a countdown to a darkness none of them could escape. The failed exorcism had a chilling effect on the town of redemption. The day after, Good Friday, was a day of profound silence and suspicion. The townspeople who had been present at the Caraway homestead were now wary of each other. The boy's words had exposed their hidden sins, turning neighbors into strangers and trust into suspicion. Jedediah, feeling the weight of the town's paranoia, knew he had to act. He rode back to the Caraway farm, the journey a quiet, somber affair. He found Elias in the barn, sitting on a bale of hay, his face buried in his hands. Martha was inside, tending to the twins, her face a mask of weary despair. "Elias," Jedediah said, his voice soft. "We need to talk. The boy, how could he know those things?" Elias looked up, his eyes bloodshot and filled with an ancient pain. "He didn't know, Jedediah. He couldn't have, not without help." Jedediah sat down beside him. "What are you saying?" "The crows," Elias whispered, the word a confession. "The legend is real. I saw them, the old ones. They were here, on this land when I first came. They told me to leave. I laughed. I thought they were just old fools, clinging to a lost way of life." He paused, a shudder running through his body. "They gave me a warning. They said the land would take back what was theirs, that the life I built would crumble from within. I didn't believe them. I bought the land anyway. I built this farm. I thought I had beaten them." A bitter, humorless laugh escaped his lips. "I was a fool, a proud, arrogant fool. I thought their words were a curse, but they were a promise. They said the land would turn on me, that my own flesh and blood would be the vessel for its vengeance." Jedediah listened, his mind trying to process the raw, irrational fear in Elias's voice. This was not a man who was just afraid of his son's illness. This was a man confessing to a profound, terrible mistake. A mistake that had come back to haunt him. "And Silas?" Jedediah asked. Elias looked at him, his eyes filled with a desperate conviction. "They're using him, Jedediah. The crows. They are using him to expose the rot in this town, the rot that I brought here. They are turning the town against itself. They are making us do their work for them." The idea was chilling. The crows, the old tribal legends, were not supernatural phantoms or ghosts. They were a symbol, a manifestation of the past. The history of this land, of the violence and injustice that had built this town, was now taking its revenge. Silas was just the messenger. As they talked, Jedediah's practical mind began to assemble the pieces. Silas, a quiet, observant boy, could have overheard conversations, learned secrets. Maybe he had a keen, almost photographic memory. The stress of his family's isolation, the heavy atmosphere of the homestead, could have broken him. The confessions, the exorcism, were a kind of psychological unraveling. He was an unwilling vessel, not for a devil, but for the buried truths of his own community. And the crows, the legends. They were the narrative the boy's mind had latched onto, the only way he could make sense of the terrible things he had learned. They were the personification of the town's guilt. Jedediah stood up, feeling a wave of terrible understanding. The crows weren't a curse. They were an explanation. They were a way for the boy to explain the evil he saw in the world. And now, the town was falling apart. Because of it. "Elias," Jedediah said, his voice firm, "we need to get him help. We need to leave this place. We can't stay here. The people, they're terrified. They'll turn on you, on all of you." Elias looked at him, his face a mixture of resignation and despair. "Where would we go, Jedediah? They said the land would take back what was theirs. This land is our life. We have nothing else." A cold wind swept through the barn, kicking up dust and hay. Jedediah looked out at the parched, unforgiving landscape. The land had a kind of vengeful beauty, a desolate power. He realized that the curse wasn't a spell or a hex. It was the land itself. The isolation, the hardship, the buried secrets that were now coming to light. As he rode back to town, Jedediah knew what he had to do. He had to convince the townspeople that Silas was just a sick boy, a victim of his own mind. He had to restore faith in reason, in logic, before the fear consumed them all. He had to face down the very real darkness that had been summoned by the whispers of a sick child. The Holy Week was not about a battle of good and evil. It was about a battle for the soul of a community, a battle they were already losing. The setting sun cast long, menacing shadows across the prairie. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise. Jedediah felt a profound sense of foreboding. He knew the coming days would be a test of his courage and of the town's sanity. And he wasn't sure either would survive. The following day, Holy Saturday, was a day of simmering tension. The town was no longer a place of quiet camaraderie. The streets were empty. People stayed inside, their doors and windows shut tight. The exposed secrets from the failed exorcism had become the town's new currency, a whispered exchange of suspicion and fear. Jedediah, riding through the desolate streets, felt like he was policing a ghost town. The air was thick with the weight of unsaid accusations. He found Reverend Abernathy in his church, sitting with his head in his hands. The Reverend looked older, his face gaunt with shame. Jedediah sat in a nearby pew, the silence in the church a heavy blanket. "The boy's words," Jedediah said, his voice low. "The things he said about your brother, are they true?" Abernathy didn't look up. He just nodded, a slow, weary motion. "I used his inheritance to build this church. I convinced myself it was for God's work. But he needed the money. He died without a home. It was a sin of pride, Jedediah. I was a hypocrite." The confession hung in the air, a raw, painful admission. Jedediah felt a profound sense of sympathy. The Reverend, a pillar of the community, had been brought low by the boy's words. It wasn't just a secret revealed, it was a man's identity, his life's work, being unraveled. "It wasn't the devil, Reverend," Jedediah said, his voice firm. "It was the truth. It was a sick child's way of dealing with something he couldn't understand, the sins of this town. They're a burden, and Silas is carrying them all." Abernathy looked up, his eyes filled with a pained mix of shame and relief. "The devil preaches with the venom of truth," he said again, a hoarse whisper. "But you're right, Jedediah. This is not a battle of faith. This is a battle for our minds. We need to do something. The people are on the brink of something terrible." They rode together to the Caraway farm, a journey filled with the oppressive silence of their thoughts. When they arrived, the scene was one of profound quiet. Elias and Martha were inside, their faces pale, their movements slow and deliberate, like people in a dream. Silas was still in his room, but something had changed. He was no longer catatonic. He was awake, his head resting on the pillow, his eyes open and alert. He looked at them as they entered, his gaze clear, but something about it was profoundly unsettling. It was the look of a man who had seen too much. It was the look of a witness. "Silas," Jedediah said, his voice gentle, "how are you feeling?" The boy didn't answer. He simply looked at them, his eyes unblinking. Jedediah knelt down, trying to meet his gaze, but the boy's eyes had a hollow emptiness to them. He was present, but his mind seemed far, far away. "He hasn't spoken since yesterday," Martha whispered, her voice a low murmur of exhaustion. "He just lies here, watching." Suddenly, a low, guttural moan came from the other side of the cabin. They all turned, a cold dread washing over them. It was Eleanor, one of the twin girls. She was on the floor, her body trembling, her eyes wide with terror. "The crows," she moaned, her voice a pained whisper. "They're in the house. They're here." Jedediah and Elias rushed to her side. Elias picked her up, her body limp and unresponsive. Her twin, Beatrice, was huddled in the corner, her hands covering her ears, her eyes shut tight. "What is it, sweetie?" Martha said, her voice trembling. "He brought them," Eleanor whispered, her gaze fixed on Silas's room. "Silas brought them. They're telling me things. About this town. About what's going to happen. About the blood." The word blood hung in the air, a chilling promise. Elias looked at Jedediah, his face a mask of profound horror. The sickness had spread. It had moved from the firstborn to the youngest. The curse was consuming his family, one member at a time. The whispers had found a new, more terrifying voice. The unraveling had begun. The chilling pronouncement from the younger twin, Eleanor, sent a fresh wave of panic through the Caraway household. The family, already on the brink, was now faced with the terrifying realization that the sickness had spread. Elias, desperate, held his daughter, her small body trembling with a fear that was not her own. Jedediah, his mind racing, now understood the terrifying progression. Silas's psychological breakdown was not an isolated event. It was the beginning of a contagion of guilt and fear. Jedediah knew he couldn't leave the family alone. He sent a rider to town, a young ranch hand named Thomas, with a clear but urgent message for the town. Tell them to stay in their homes, to lock their doors. Tell them the sickness has spread. The message was vague, but its implications were clear. The town was already on edge. The news of another afflicted Caraway child would be a spark to the powder keg. The collective fear, the guilt, and the superstition that had been festering in the town would now reach a boiling point. The people of Redemption, in their terrified minds, were not facing a psychological crisis. They were facing a spiritual war, a war they believed they were losing. The sun began to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the prairie. The Caraway homestead was a small island of terror in a sea of encroaching darkness. Elias and Martha, their faces haggard with exhaustion and fear, huddled with their daughters. Silas lay on his bed, his eyes still open, still watching, a silent, chilling witness to the unfolding horror. Jedediah sat on the porch, his rifle resting against his knee. He was no longer just a sheriff. He was a sentinel, a lone figure standing between a family and a town on the brink of madness. He knew the people of Redemption were not afraid of the crows or a devil. They were afraid of each other. They were afraid of the truths that had been exposed, the secrets that had been laid bare. The night air grew cold, a sharp contrast to the day's oppressive heat. The sound of a lone coyote howl cut through the silence, a mournful, lonely sound that echoed the emptiness in the pit of Jedediah's stomach. He thought of his own sins, of the compromises he had made, the people he had failed to protect. Was his own reckoning coming? Was he too a hypocrite, a man who had sworn to uphold the law but had often looked the other way? Suddenly a new sound, the sound of hoofbeats. Jedediah rose, his hand instinctively going to his rifle. It wasn't Thomas, it was a group of men, a dozen of them, their faces grim and determined in the pale moonlight. Mr. Henderson was at the front, his face a mask of terror and righteous fury. "Sheriff," Henderson's voice was a low growl, "we've come to help. We've come to put an end to this." Jedediah felt a cold dread settle over him. He knew what put an end to this meant. It meant fire, it meant vengeance, it meant a lynching. "Henderson, you'll turn back now," Jedediah said, his voice hard. "This family is under my protection." "Protection from what?" another man shouted. "From the devil himself? The boy is cursed. He is bringing a plague upon this town. He's corrupting our children. We have to burn it out." Jedediah raised his rifle, pointing it at the ground. "I said you'll turn back. There will be no violence here. This is not a devil. It's a sickness of the mind, a sickness we've all helped create." His words fell on deaf ears. The men dismounted, their faces a mix of fear and conviction. One of them held a torch, the flickering flame casting an eerie, dancing light on their faces. "The Reverend himself said it," Henderson snarled. "The devil preaches the truth. He said it himself. We're not going to let this plague destroy us." Jedediah stood his ground, a lone figure against a mob of terrified, righteous men. He looked at their faces and saw not a group of neighbors, but a congregation of fear. The crows, the legends, the curse. It was all coming to a head. The town of redemption was about to destroy itself. The Holy Week was not a time of salvation, but a prelude to a final, brutal reckoning. Jedediah tightened his grip on the rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this wasn't about a boy or a family. This was about a town's soul, and whether it would choose reason or terror. The storm had finally arrived, and Jedediah was standing right in the middle of it. Remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more dark, real-life horror stories. The standoff was a tense, agonizing tableau in the pale moonlight. Jedediah, his rifle lowered but ready, stood between the mob and the Caraway home. The men, their faces contorted by fear and anger, were a terrifying reflection of the town's collective descent into madness. Mr. Henderson, his face a grim mask, his voice thick with a raw, almost desperate conviction, was the mob's unofficial leader. His eyes, normally narrowed with a cynical scrutiny, were now wide with a zealous, frightening light. The air was a thick soup of dust and palpable dread, a profound silence broken only by the nervous shuffling of feet and the low, guttural murmur of the mob. "Jedediah, move out of the way," Henderson shouted, his voice a ragged, desperate plea that was more a cry of terror than a command. "This isn't about hate. It's about survival. We can't let this evil spread. It's a sickness that will consume us all. This is not evil, Henderson. This is a boy who is sick and a family that is suffering." Jedediah's voice was a low, steady command, a beacon of reason in the rising tide of hysteria. He held his ground, his boots digging into the dry earth. "You are not men of God tonight. You are a mob. You are a collection of frightened people acting on gossip and superstition. You are turning your backs on the very principles you claim to hold dear." The word mob hung in the air, a stark, uncomfortable truth. The men looked at each other, their resolve wavering. Some of them had been Jedediah's friends for years, and the accusation struck home. Their faces shifted, a fleeting moment of doubt breaking through the fanaticism. But their fear, a potent, living thing that had been festering for days, was stronger than their shame. The man with the torch, a wiry, nervous homesteader named Thomas, stepped forward, his eyes glazed with a grim determination. "What do you propose, Sheriff?" he asked, his voice shaking. "We just let it happen. Let the sickness take our children. He told us what we are. He showed us our sins. This is our penance, Jedediah. God is testing us." Jedediah's mind raced, a frantic search for the one truth that could pierce their collective delusion. He had to give them a different enemy, one they could fight with reason rather than fire and pitchforks. He had to make them see the profound, terrible reality of their own actions. "Silas isn't the problem," Jedediah said, his voice rising in conviction, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. The secrets he spoke of, they were not born of a devil. They were born of the town. We are the problem, not him. The sickness is in us, not in that boy. He is a mirror, and you don't like what you see. You want to smash the mirror, but all that will do is leave you with 7 years of bad luck. He turned to Mr. Henderson, his gaze direct and unyielding. Mr. Henderson, Silas spoke of your debt and you believed him. You believe that the devil knows your secrets. But what if it's simpler? What if the boy saw you? What if he heard you? What if the secrets we hide are not hidden at all, but are plain for a sick, observant boy to see? He's not a vessel for evil. He's a vessel for our own buried shame. He's our conscience, and we want to silence him. Henderson's face wavered. The rational thought was a crack in the wall of his fear. The other men began to murmur, their anger and resolve beginning to crumble into doubt. The idea that their secrets were not divine knowledge but just common gossip overheard by a child was a profoundly humiliating thought. The prospect of facing their neighbors in the full light of day, knowing their private sins were now public knowledge, was almost as terrifying as the prospect of facing a demon. Suddenly, a new sound. A shrill, terrified scream from inside the house. It was a piercing, soul-shattering cry that cut through the silence of the night and the growing doubt of the mob. Jedediah and Elias, who had been watching from the doorway, rushed inside. The mob, their attention diverted from their wavering resolve, followed them, their torch a flickering beacon of violence and morbid fascination. Inside, the scene was one of utter chaos. Martha was on the floor, her hands clasped to her ears, a high, keening wail escaping her lips. The twin girls, Eleanor and Beatrice, were huddled together, but Eleanor was no longer whimpering. She was laughing, a high-pitched, maniacal cackle that was both terrifying and utterly unnatural. Her small body convulsed with a raw, primal mirth. "Look!" she shrieked, her eyes wide and manic, staring at a corner of the room where only shadows lay. "The old ones, the crows, they're coming for us. They're coming for the blood. They said the land will take its toll. They're in the walls. They're in the wood." Elias rushed to his daughter, holding her close, trying to quiet her. But her laughter was contagious. Beatrice, who had been silent, now began to sob uncontrollably, her small body trembling with a fresh wave of terror. The sight of their children, their innocence shattered by this unknown horror, broke Jedediah's heart. Silas, on the bed, his face still and impassive, turned his head and looked at the terrified crowd. His eyes were wide and unblinking, holding a terrifying clarity. "The time is now," he said, his voice the dry, rasping sound that had chilled them all before, a sound like a whisper from a grave. "The sins of the fathers will be paid, in blood. The reckoning is here." The words were a final, terrifying prophecy. The mob, who had been wavering, now felt a fresh wave of panic and conviction. This was not a sick boy. This was a vessel for something terrible. The fire of their fear, which Jedediah had tried to extinguish with reason, now burned with a fresh, terrifying intensity. The whispers, the gossip, the confessions, they were no longer just stories. They were a divine judgment. "This is it!" Henderson screamed, his face a mask of furious terror. "We have to stop it. We have to burn it out. The whole family is cursed. The whole house is cursed." The man with the torch, Thomas, took another step forward, his eyes fixed on the Caraway home. He raised the torch, a small, insignificant flame against the vast night sky, and prepared to throw it. Jedediah drew his gun, pointing it at the ground, a single final warning. "I will not let you do this. This is your last chance." But the mob was no longer listening. Their fear had overtaken their reason. They were a single, terrifying entity, their will bent on a single destructive act. The storm had finally broken, and there would be no going back. The mob, driven by a primal, unthinking fear, surged forward. They moved as a single organism, a churning mass of dust and fury. Jedediah fired a shot into the air, the loud report echoing across the desolate prairie, a lonely, defiant sound. The sound gave them a moment's pause, a fleeting hesitation. But it was not enough. Their terror was too great, their conviction too strong. "Move, Jedediah!" Henderson screamed, his face contorted in a mixture of rage and terror. "Get out of the way. We'll not let this evil consume our town. We'll not let our children be corrupted." Jedediah stood his ground, his gun now aimed directly at the man with the torch. "The first man who takes a step forward will be the last, I swear it." The threat was real, but in the fever pitch of the moment it was meaningless. The man with the torch, Thomas, his eyes wide and vacant, as if in a trance, took a step forward. He was a small man, known for his gentle demeanor and his quiet faith. Now he was a vessel for the town's madness. Jedediah, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, looked at him, at the face of a man who had lost his mind to fear, and squeezed the trigger. The shot was a small, sharp sound in the vast silence. Thomas fell, a small, dark stain spreading on his shirt like a blooming flower of death. The torch clattered to the ground, its flame flickering and dying in the dust, a final despairing gasp of light. The mob recoiled, a collective gasp of shock and horror escaping their lips. They stood frozen, their righteous fury replaced by a profound, shattering grief. Jedediah stood over the fallen man, his gun still raised. His hands were shaking, but his voice was firm. "Does this feel like the devil's work?" he shouted, his voice raw with emotion. "Does this feel like a holy crusade? This is murder. This is the blood of a good man, shed because you were too afraid to think. You wanted a sacrifice. Well, you have it." His words, and the sight of their fallen comrade, finally broke the mob's momentum. They stood frozen, their faces pale with shock and grief. The reality of what they were doing, what they were becoming, finally sank in. They were not righteous men of God. They were a mob, and they were killing each other. Suddenly, a new sound, a piercing, soul-shattering shriek came from inside the Caraway house. It wasn't Eleanor's manic laughter. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. It was a sound that didn't belong to a human throat, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the world. The mob, still reeling from the gunshot, looked at the house. Their fear reignited. Jedediah, his heart in his throat, turned and ran inside, Elias and Martha close behind him. The scene inside was one of a waking nightmare. Eleanor was on the floor, her body trembling violently, her eyes rolled back in her head. She was no longer laughing or speaking of the crows. She was screaming, a long, drawn-out cry of pure pain. But the sound wasn't coming from her mouth. It was coming from Silas. The boy, who had been lying motionless on the bed, was now in a catatonic state again. But his eyes were open, and they were fixed on Eleanor. The scream was his. It was coming from his chest, his throat, a horrifying, inhuman sound that seemed to be tearing his body apart. His small body convulsed, his hands were clenched into fists, and a thin line of blood ran from his nose down his cheek. He was in profound, terrible torment, a silent scream of agony. Elias and Martha rushed to Eleanor, trying to comfort her, but Jedediah's eyes were fixed on Silas. The boy was in torment. His body was convulsing, and the scream, the sound of pure agony, was now a constant, soul-shattering wail. It was the sound of a mind breaking, of a soul being ripped apart. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The scream cut off, replaced by a profound, terrifying silence. Silas's eyes closed. His body went limp. He was still. The mob, who had followed Jedediah inside, stood in the doorway, their faces a mixture of confusion and renewed fear. The silence was more unnerving than the scream. It was the silence of something terrible having just happened. And then, Jedediah looked at Silas's hands, clasped together on his chest. They were stained with a dark, wet substance. He looked at Elias's hands, trying to comfort Eleanor, and saw the same dark stain. The crows, the blood, the sins of the father. The prophecy of a sick boy had just come true. The cost of redemption had been paid. In blood. And the Holy Week was not yet over. The remaining hours of Holy Saturday were a blur of chaos and desperation. The mob, their righteous fury replaced by a profound, shattering grief, carried their fallen comrade, Thomas, back to town. They were no longer a mob, but a collection of broken men, their fear replaced by a chilling understanding of the horror they had nearly unleashed. The silence that fell over the town was not one of peace, but of a deep, collective shame. Jedediah, his mind a storm of grief and confusion, tried to make sense of the events. Silas had not been possessed by a devil. The crows were not vengeful spirits. The blood was not a curse. The truth, as it so often is, was far more mundane and far more terrifying. He spent the rest of the night with the Caraway family. Elias and Martha, their faces ashen, held their children. Eleanor and Beatrice were now quiet, but their eyes held a profound, haunted emptiness. Silas, the vessel for the town's secrets, was in a deep, peaceful sleep. He would be fine. He would recover. But the town of redemption never would. The next morning, Easter Sunday, the sun rose on a town that was broken. The bell of the church, which should have been a sound of celebration, was instead a solemn toll for the dead. The townspeople, their faces pale and drawn, gathered in front of the sheriff's office, a silent, grim-faced jury. They did not come for answers, but for absolution. They looked at Jedediah, the man who had stopped them, the man who had been forced to kill one of their own to save a family from their own fear. Jedediah, his face a mask of weariness, stood on the small porch. He was no longer just the sheriff. He was a witness. A man who had seen the darkness in the hearts of his neighbors and had been forced to kill to stop them. He looked at the faces in the crowd, at the men who had been a mob just hours before, and saw the profound guilt in their eyes. He began to speak, his voice low and steady, carrying across the silent street. He didn't speak of the devil or of curses. He spoke of the truth. He spoke of Silas, a sensitive, observant boy who, in his fevered state, had overheard the secrets of his town. He spoke of Elias, a man burdened by his own past, whose fear had become a contagion, spreading through his family and then through the town. He spoke of the townspeople, of their petty jealousies and their hidden sins, which had become a psychological prison. He spoke of the crows, not as vengeful spirits but as a metaphor. A metaphor for the buried past, for the injustices that had been committed on this land. The land itself had become a character in the story, a silent witness to the sins of its new masters. The legends of the crows, once just old stories, had become the only way a sick boy could make sense of the rot he saw in the world around him. And he spoke of the blood. The blood that had been spilled, not by a curse, but by a fear that had turned men into monsters. He said that the man he had killed, Thomas, had died not by his hand, but by a fever of terror, a fever that had consumed a whole town. He said that the blood on Silas's hands had come from a nosebleed, a physical manifestation of his fevered state. The boy had been a victim of his own mind, and his family had been the victims of the town's fear. Jedediah's words were a bitter pill, a harsh dose of reality that shattered the romantic narrative of a holy battle. There was no devil. There was no magic. There was just human fear, human weakness, and human violence. When he was done, there was a long, painful silence. The people of redemption looked at each other, their faces filled with a profound sense of shame. Their sins had been exposed, not by a demon, but by a child. Their righteous crusade had been a moment of collective madness. The Holy Week, which had begun with whispers of a devil, ended with the truth that the true evil had been in their own hearts all along. The sheriff's account, A stark, unsentimental telling of a town's unraveling would go down in history. The legend would grow, the details embellished, the truth twisted until it became a terrifying myth. The townsfolk would claim that Satan had preached, that the boy was a vessel for pure evil. The story would be told and retold until the real truth of human frailty, of collective guilt, and of the price of fear was lost forever, buried in the blood-stained soil of a forgotten West Texas town. Jedediah Cole would remain the sheriff of redemption for a few more years, a grim, weary guardian of a town that was a shadow of its former self. He would never again look at his neighbors with the same trust, never again believe that they were immune to the darkness within. The Caraway family, scarred but alive, would eventually sell their homestead and move away, leaving the cursed land behind. Redemption never fully recovered. The seeds of suspicion and fear, once planted, would never be fully rooted out. The town, once a beacon of hope on the frontier, would become a place of quiet, lingering despair. The legend would live on, a ghost story told around campfires. But the real horror, the one that Jedediah knew, was not in a devil or a curse. It was in the human heart. And the truth, like the dust of West Texas, would remain, a silent, chilling monument to the week that a town lost its soul.